Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Everything You Need to Know About Implementing and Monetizing Microsoft Teams Calling, sponsored by Ribbon Communications. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit them to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we will ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen, and it will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. An on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I would now like to turn the event over to Heavy Reading's Chief Analyst, Jim Hodges. Jim?
Thanks, operator. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar, which is entitled Everything You Need to Know About Implementing and Monetizing Microsoft Teams Calling. My name is Jim Hodges, Chief Analyst at Heavy Reading, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we get started, let me introduce our speaker. So joining us today from Ribbon Communications is Dwight Morris. Dwight is Principal Solutions and Marketing Specialist at Ribbon Communications. Welcome, Dwight. I'm looking forward to your presentations.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, so in terms of the way the webinar is structured, there's a couple of different sections. We're going to start by really focusing on enterprise services, and really, because I think, one of the key themes of today's webinar is that enterprise services and even the architectures are really kind of changing due to cloud adoption. So kind of in order to sort of set the discussion and frame the discussion, we're going to first look at kind of the evolution of enterprise services in terms of a number of factors. And then we'll look at the impact of Microsoft Teams adoption and really what it means for enterprise services. And as kind of a key part of this discussion, we're going to first be looking at the importance of a specific Microsoft Teams feature called direct routing. And we'll look at that from a services implementation perspective and kind of looking at the value proposition and what it means for service providers providing enterprise services. And then really to kind of quantify the value proposition of Microsoft Teams with the direct routing feature, what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time, we're going to kind of do a deep dive on a number of the different call flows that address the implementation options. And here we'll also kind of give you not only sort of the technical requirements and how it works, but we'll also provide some of the value propositions as well. And then we're going to wrap up, take your questions. We'll also be stopping twice to ask you, the audience, to provide some input into some of the 2 poll questions that we're going to be running. And the poll questions obviously will be related to some of the topics that we're presenting, the concepts. And then we'll also spend some time at the end to kind of take your questions. So in terms of the evolution of enterprise, I'm going to just kind of cover a couple of slides to, as I said, sort of frame the discussion. And I think, and obviously Dwight will build on some of these topics and some of these concepts. But I think it's fair to say that there are many factors that are kind of fueling the sort of the services evolution model from an enterprise perspective. But obviously, cloud adoption has to be kind of the lead factor. I mean, I think when you think about what's happening, the cloud is influencing enterprise services, carrier services, all really services, and it's really kind of driving a new model for even how end users and subscribers look at where they can gain access to their services. I think so. Because of that, I think we're seeing, continuing to see the line blurring between enterprise and other CSP cloud-based integrated services. This has been happening some time, but as we continue to move applications to the cloud, it's going to continue to blur. And I think obviously because of that, we're obviously seeing both service providers and over-the-top providers such as Microsoft still positioning for success and how they're going to be successful in this new marketplace. And I think really when you look at going forward in terms of the evolution of enterprise services, I think really it comes down to, in terms of success, there's going to be a number of contributing factors or fundamental attributes. And I think the first one to me is implementation flexibility, continued service performance, scale, and even seamless interworking. I think these are things that enterprise customers now demand them, but they're going to be increasingly important as we kind of move more applications to the cloud and kind of move to this all software-driven model. And as I said, we're going to be focusing on why and how Microsoft Teams is really kind of a major step forward in kind of meeting these requirements, and as I said, including the new features such as direct routing, which provides considerable value for that. So I wanted to move on to the next slide, but I want to continue the discussion on using these same categories: implementation flexibility, continued service performance, scale, seamless interworking. So what I wanted to do on this slide before I hand it over to Dwight is kind of just sort of look at using these same attributes, look at kind of the legacy enterprise service model, and then look at it from a cloud-based enterprise model, but also a cloud-based Teams enterprise service model. So if we take a minute and think about implementation flexibility, I think it's fair to say that with the legacy model, there's often limited by vendor on-premise products, because of what those products supported, how they're implemented, how they're integrated. And I think because of that, you had longer implementation times for new features, so it was, I think, ultimately more difficult to monetize. If you look at it from a cloud-based Teams enterprise model, and obviously software is really not limited to an on-prem model anymore. So because of that, you have more flexibility. So therefore, you have shorter implementation times and obviously greater potential to monetize. In terms of level of service performance, to be fair, the legacy enterprise service model always had high-quality service. So that hasn't really changed, but that came at a price of I would say, kind of a static engineering model. So it was well designed, well engineered. But because of that, you had to be careful in terms of if you were going to add new services to make sure you had enough capacity and so on. Whereas we kind of moved to the cloud-based model, you still have the same high quality, but you kind of move away from needing to conform to a really kind of rigidly engineered model. So it provides you more flexibility. And I said here it also supports a continuing improvement model. And what I mean by that is, obviously, the cloud is kind of driven by continuous improvement and new features, new applications, and the cloud by nature is something that's easily upgradable to kind of support this continuous improvement model. In terms of scale, if you look at the legacy enterprise model, I think it was limited and expensive to scale. There's limitations often between sort of branch and remote offices in terms of services and capacity. Whereas you look at the cloud-based model, I think it's low-cost, elastic scale for both branch and remote offices, really no limitations on where the subscriber is. It's really kind of a distributed cloud model, so all the users have kind of a common platform in terms of service access and scale. And seamless interworking, I think this is an important one as well. I think in the past with the legacy model, we had kind of a very complex interworking model. It was kind of heavily dependent on performance testing, certifications. And because of that, I think CSPs often had limited control in sort of overall service assurance and call completion in terms of if a call was handed off to a certain server, an enterprise server for completion. Now, not to say we're not going to continue to have testing and certification even in the cloud, because we will, but I think one of the advantages of a cloud-based team model is that it's simplified interworking model, and as we'll see with the direct routing, it kind of gives the CSPs a much greater role to play in managing enterprise services kind of on an end-to-end basis, including things like service assurance and call completion. So we're going to talk about these kind of concepts and some of these capabilities in more detail, and Dwight's going to be leading the discussion here. So with that, Dwight, I'll push out your first slide, and I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. Before we get into all of the specifics about how the calls flow, let's talk about what Teams is in general. I think that it's something that's relatively new. Microsoft came up with Teams a couple of years ago. They introduced it at Enterprise Connect. And when we talk about it in this industry, we usually talk about the calling capabilities, but it's much more than that. It's persistent chat, collaboration, file sharing. There's a calendar in Teams. You can have meetings. Obviously, we're going to be talking about calling today, but there's also other plugins that you can put into it. The idea is that Microsoft wants you to spend the majority of your day in Teams, and a lot of people have been doing that. They told us at Enterprise Connect this year that in the 2 years since they launched it, they have over 500,000 organizations that are using Teams, which is pretty incredible when you think about an application. But when you consider that it's Microsoft and that Teams comes with Office 365, it's a little bit less incredible. So it's something that everybody really needs to pay attention to. People are definitely utilizing Teams, and they're not just they don't just have licenses. The Microsoft Teams comes with the enterprise licenses that Microsoft sells, the E1, 3, E5, but they also came out this summer and they said that they've got over 13 million daily active users. So it's not just that they've got the license and the what we used to call shelfware, that it's sitting there dormant. People are actually using Microsoft Teams. And so that's something that we're hearing more and more about. Lots of times when I talk to service providers, their customers are asking them about being able to use Teams calling, and we'll be talking about that today. But the other piece of it is that Microsoft themselves at Ignite a couple of years ago, they said that they were going to make Teams they were bringing calling capabilities into Teams, and that they would be making that their primary client for communications in Office 365. So that's a big deal. When you talk to the Microsoft people and you start to talk about Skype to them, which is obviously very prevalent, and I think that they're very happy that a lot of people are using Skype for business, their real main concern, their focus is on Microsoft Teams and using that for calling, and that's really what they want to talk about. It used to be that the communication service providers were at odds with Microsoft. Microsoft, when they first came out, they said, well, we want to be a global carrier. We want everybody to make phone calls through us, and we'll connect you to the PSTN. And then they started to implement that, and they got to about 10 different countries where they had that implemented, and they realized just how difficult and how long that was going to take. And so what they did was they sort of changed course. And they came up with a concept called direct routing. Direct routing is a capability of the phone system. The phone system is basically Microsoft's Cloud PBX. In fact, they used to call it Cloud PBX when it was Skype for Business Online. Now it's called the phone system, and phone system we'll go over the different components of the phone system when we talk about the call flows. But having a session border controller allows you to connect your SIP trunks and basically what they termed bring your own trunk to Microsoft Teams. So now they're not the ones that are providing the calling plans. It's the communication service providers, right? It's yourselves that are coming through and saying, we will connect you to Office 365, to phone system, and you'll be able to make calls. You'll be able to keep your current carrier, and that's something that everybody likes. And it has a much more global reach than what Microsoft was able to provide before. So this is something that they did a little over a year ago. I want to say they announced it on June 28th of 2018. And since then, we've seen a number of different service providers coming up with this. And what they're doing is they're selling their customers something called direct routing as a service. So it's just another line item on the bill that says that we'll connect your Microsoft Teams users to the PSTN. One of the things that you might notice in this picture in the middle, it says certified session border controller, and that's very important. Jim mentioned earlier about the continuous improvement in the cloud. Continuous improvement is Microsoft making updates. It's the whole agile development theory where you get feedback from your customers, you implement that in small pieces, and then you put that out to them and then get their feedback and then continue to develop. Instead of having a Teams version 2019 and then another one that's 2020, what they're doing is they're updating it every month. And you can go to their website and find out what the new capabilities are for the month. The capabilities actually of Microsoft Teams calling have really come in line. They announced last December that the capabilities were on par with Skype for Business Online. Not Skype for Business on premises at the time, but Skype for Business Online. But they continue to add things like Call Park, And so it's becoming much more viable, and people are taking it much more seriously. But that certified session border controller, what that means is that you've got companies, vendors such as Ribbon, that work with Microsoft and test those new capabilities before they get provisioned to the cloud, to the public. And what that means is that you know that if you use a certified session border controller, that it's going to work with Teams because it's already been tested with those things beforehand. The other piece of that is Microsoft support. I actually came up through support out of college, and I was one of those people back when you used to call an 800 line, and you'd call and you'd say, this is what's wrong with your product, and I would try to help you out. Microsoft has a support center as well, obviously, and if they're trying to help you with any issue that is resulting from Microsoft Teams calling, there gets to a point with any help desk or support center where they're not really sure what's going on, and they've eliminated all of the variables. And one of the last variables that they'll eliminate is that session border controller. And if you're using a session border controller that they haven't tested in-house, then they reserve the right to say, well, why don't you try a certified session border controller and call me back? And that's certainly not a position you want to be in. So you want to make sure that the session border controllers that you're using are certified by Microsoft. And Ribbon has the largest portfolio of session border controllers, ranging from edge devices, which we'll kind of concentrate on here today, to core network devices that can be provisioned in a multi-tenant environment and handle over 100,000 concurrent sessions. Excuse me. So this is what I'm talking about, the direct routing as a service, right? So one of the things, however, that you have to understand when you do that, and I'm sure that you do, is that you're going to be held responsible for the service quality issues. And it doesn't matter where those quality issues stem from, right? If the customer is having a problem with their LAN and they can't make a phone call because of that, they're going to call you and they're going to say, hey, direct routing isn't working. I can't make phone calls out to the PSTN through my Teams client. And so you want to have a good handle on exactly where those issues are, and how to take a look at that, and how to troubleshoot that, and how that scales, because you're going to have, hopefully, very many customers, and they're going to be in a lot of different locations. So essentially, migrating from, and Jim talked about the legacy systems and going to the cloud and the differences. And here, this is overly simplistic, right? But you're connecting to your legacy PBX over the LAN. You have control. The customer has control over the LAN, and they're not going to blame you for that. And it's probably going to be quite reliable. And they do the same thing when you've got a certified SBC. Now, that certified SBC, it could be here. I'm saying that it's on premises. That we've dropped it on the customer's network edge. The difference there you'll see is that it has to connect to Office 365 over the wide area network, over the internet, and that's the big difference, right? That's the thing that we're going to concentrate on the next few slides. I mentioned this before, that you're going to have geographically distributed locations. If you're a large enterprise, then you have these, right? You've got headquarters in one city, and then you've got remote offices in other cities. If you're a service provider, then you have customers at many different locations, but you're going to be the one that's responsible. So it's almost like you're the headquarters in that regard, right? And lots of times, the way, or sort of traditionally, the way that we've done things before applications moved to the cloud was that we would get MPLS circuits from the remote offices back to the data center so that we had a good connection so that we could access the server that happened to be in the data center. Well, now that data center is in the cloud, and that makes things a little bit different. You're not necessarily, customers aren't necessarily going to go back to their data center. And if you're the service provider and you're providing connectivity, you want to think about this as well. And what you want to do is you want to take advantage of the Microsoft Global Network. Microsoft has spent an awful lot of money on their network. It's the second largest network in the world, and what they have is dark fiber between their data centers that are located in all over the world. And they have what they call front doors, and they have over 145 front doors in different locations around the world. And what that does basically is it gets you onto the Microsoft Global Network. So rather than having traffic go back to the data center and then up to Microsoft, you can go directly, locally, up to the Microsoft network and get on their global network and then let them direct the network traffic through their global network to where it needs to be around the world. It's going to be much faster because they've spent a lot more money than any business ever could. They've got dark fiber, they've got underwater cables. They've spared no expense to make sure that that all of these front doors and that they would be able to get back to the places where they need to go. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that we're talking about voice. And, when we're talking about SIP, then we're talking about two pieces, right? We're talking about the signaling and we're talking about the media. And the signaling is just, all right, this is the person that I want to talk to. How do I get to them and make that connection? It's mostly text. It's not a big deal. But I'm talking to you now over a network, and that's the audio is coming through. And it's important when you are talking or you're on a video conference or even if you're transferring, you're sharing a desktop, that it's important that you don't have latency, right? You want that network to be as fast as possible because otherwise what you're going to have is you're going to have things like jitter. I'm sure that we've all been on a VoIP call before and have heard people's voices start to sound strange, and that's because the codec is doing its best to resolve latency and packet loss issues. And so you want to try to avoid those at the outset as best you can. And what Microsoft recommends, and up in the top right corner of this, is that you connect to the internet locally, to the Microsoft and to the Microsoft network locally, and then let them get you back to wherever it is that you need to go. All right, so how do we make sure that we've got reliable connections? One of the ways, and I showed it on that first slide, was to have a session border controller on premises. One of the, when you're talking about having local access, that makes sense that they would be able to get out locally and connect to that global network as quickly as possible. So if you've got a session border controller that is on premises, one of the main things that you need to think about is WAN failover, right? Is redundancy with regard to the connection. What happens if a connection goes down? Maybe that's a problem with the network. Maybe it's a problem with the port. But for whatever reason, business continuity is a conversation that you don't want to have with a customer, right? Because as soon as they lose communications, they're losing money, and that's not a happy customer. So we have devices actually where we have multiple WAN ports and even LTE access for wireless WAN that you can fail over to one port if there's a problem with the primary port. You can fail over to a secondary. And then the other thing that you can do with that as well is bandwidth aggregation. You can say, what traffic goes over what port if you're going to be utilizing both of those ports on a continuous basis. All of that helps you with the reliability of the connection. and that reliability is obviously essential to a happy customer. Second thing, be proactive. It's better to see a problem and start working on it before your customer calls you and asks you about it. And excuse me, a simple way to do this with VoIP calls is the mean opinion scores. The mean opinion scores are basically sort of a human factor figuring out like whether or not the quality of this audio connection was good or not. I'm sure if anybody used Skype for Business, you get that questionnaire at the end that says how was your experience. It's not using that necessarily for a mean opinion score, but it's along the same lines that you're going back and you're finding out how many packets were lost and if there was latency in the network. A mean opinion score that is 4 or above is considered pretty good. If it's less than that, then you want to know about it. And what we have in our EdgeMark devices is the ability to create triggers. And those triggers can alert you to the fact that there's a mean opinion score that is below a certain threshold, below that 4. And so knowing that and being able to see that before the customer calls you is definitely going to be helpful in keeping a happy customer. But you have to be able to do something with that mean opinion score or that alert that comes through, and being able to troubleshoot remotely is important. I'm sure everybody understands that truck rolls are not something that everybody wants to have during their quarterly business review. They don't want to say that, yeah, we had to send a bunch of technicians out to all of these different places. Much better if you can do these things remotely. And our EdgeMark devices have a management system, which is EdgeView, that takes care that monitors, not just monitors the devices, but also manages devices. You can remotely go in and take a look at the calls, drilling down into the step ladder and getting into the details to find out where the issue was resolved. Another thing that they do is they will give you a score on both the LAN and the WAN side, which is very nice, because the WAN is something that you're going to own and you're responsible for, but the LAN side is something that is their issue. And being able to show evidence that the problem is actually coming from within is again going to help you from not doing a lot of troubleshooting unnecessarily on your half of the network where there's nothing going on that's of issue. But to give that to them so that they can send that back to their team and deal with it on their own. And again, it decreases the time to resolution of a lot of these issues, but it also will decrease the frustration on the customer's part. And plan for success. What I mean by that is you can actually do some very simple yet powerful SD-WAN functionality with the EdgeMark devices. The traffic prioritization is one of these things. So what I can say is I want the Microsoft Teams traffic to have a higher priority over the data traffic. So you can look at a person's network over time, and I'm sure that you'll see that during the lunch hour, people will maybe sit at their desks and they'll surf the web. And nowadays, surfing the web is a lot of media. There's a lot of video that people are looking at. But if you've got somebody that's on a customer call at that same time and there's network degradation because it's being overused, being able to prioritize the business traffic is something, again, that's going to be very helpful. And that's something that you can do with the EdgeMark devices that Ribbon provides. So all of these things can actually be rolled up into another line item in the invoice, right? You've got you're selling internet access, and then you've got direct routing and maybe some things over the top. But service assurance, being able to remotely monitor and troubleshoot and configure devices, as well as update the firmware. You can even come up with a monthly report to give to your customer. That's another line item that you can add to your invoice and increase your revenue. All right, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Dwight. So with that, we're going to stop here. So thanks, Dwight, for that presentation for the first part. We're going to stop here and conduct our first poll question. So the question is, what has kept your organization from implementing Microsoft Teams? Is it you use other communication platforms, you just haven't had a chance to try it, it's still relatively new, not sure it will deliver increased performance or security, or we're just behind in our cloud transformation? So if you can provide your answers to us now, that would be great. But Dwight, while we're waiting, you talked a lot about kind of service assurance and remote monitoring. And I mean, from my perspective, one of the greatest challenges that enterprises had is kind of managing kind of the discrepancy sometimes between services, between kind of branch offices and kind of the corporate offices. And I think what you're saying here is that the service assurance part of that, because you're able to kind of manage and follow this sort of continuous improvement upgrade model, that it really kind of brings things together in terms of service parity and sort of monitoring. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair statement. And I think, there's sort of two ways to provide direct routing as a service, and that is to have customers come into your network and have the SBC on your network. And we see a lot of people doing that. But we also have service providers that are doing both. They're dropping these edge devices, and it makes it much easier when you can remotely monitor and configure those devices. And then obviously, with Microsoft and talking about their global network, and depending on how the network is set up, and we'll show you how the media flows and why that's important. That having a device that doesn't really cost a lot of money to have that device out there, but it affords you a lot of visibility into and a lot of choices. Okay.
So one of the audience members put a question that my volume is a bit low, so I'm going to talk a little bit louder, so I hope I'm not too loud. Okay, so let's see what the audience said here in terms of implementing Microsoft Teams, and they're saying some of them use other communication platforms. That's 53%. 18% haven't had a chance to try it. 18% said it's relatively new, and kind of 6% said they weren't really sure it would deliver that. Is there any sort of surprise here? I mean, I think in terms of the haven't had a chance to try it, as you said, there's been a lot of push to use these features going forward. As I said, the enterprise has a lot of entrenched capabilities already. Is there any sort of surprise here for you, Dwight?
No, I think it's a train that's coming down the track as far as Microsoft is concerned, right? I think that people started going to the cloud 10, 15 years ago, and they're still on their way. I think that the audio real-time communications has sort of lagged behind that for a number of different reasons. And one of those, the primary, is that they're already using something else, and if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to move into the second part of the presentation. We said that we would look at some actual Microsoft Teams call flows with direct routing. So we're going to get into that, and this will be fairly interactive. So Dwight will present, and I'll kind of stop him and ask him some questions and make sure I understand everything he's presenting. So I'm going to push out your first slide, Dwight, so please go ahead.
All right, we'll talk about the actual call flows with Microsoft Teams, and this is where the global network, you'll see why it's a little bit more important. What you see there, the box with the dotted line is Azure, and within Azure you've got Office 365. You also have the phone system, and the phone system, the components that we're showing here that are part of the phone system are a transport relay in the corner there, a call controller, and a media controller and a media processor. Now, Teams is different in that it uses HTTP REST for signaling. It doesn't use SIP signaling, excuse me. And we'll show how that kind of gets resolved later on. And then the media is sent over the real-time protocol, secure real-time protocol. So when a user makes a call, let's say that I'm calling somebody that is in my organization, we're on the same LAN, it's still going to go up to the call controller in the Azure cloud, right? That's where the PBX, the cloud PBX is, the phone system. So it goes up to the call controller to find out how to route that call. That's why things like WAN failover are important, that you're going to always need to have that connectivity, even to make local phone calls. And then that call controller finds the person that's in my organization, and it decides that they're in my organization, which means that the media is going to pass peer-to-peer. It's going to pass directly. As long as I can resolve the address of the other person, that media is not going to go up into the cloud. And Microsoft does a good job. They don't want that media to take a longer path than is absolutely necessary. They want it to have an optimal path. Here, the optimal path is over the LAN, so that call quality will be as high as it can be. But what happens if you've got a router in between those two people and you have to do some network address if you have to translate I couldn't think of the word. You have to translate the address between the two people because their addresses are hidden. You can see here that the media is not going to be able to go peer-to-peer because I can't resolve that address. So in that instance, what happens is it goes up through the transport relay. Now, this is where the global network comes into play because that transport relay is in the Azure cloud. If I'm in the same company, but that is going from one country to another country, it has to go up into that transport relay and then over to the other person. And you want that to be as short as possible. So what I don't want is to say, let's say, for instance, that I'm traveling and I go down to Microsoft Ignite in Florida, but I'm actually from Europe. Well, if it sees that I'm from Europe, normally it would take the media and send it through Europe, but I happen to be in Florida. What Microsoft has in their network is they've got these transport relays all over the world. And what they'll do is they'll dynamically figure out which one is the closest to that person, depending on where they happen to be, the request happens to be coming from. And they'll use the one that is closest. So again, when you're talking about getting up into that Microsoft cloud, you want to get up to that Microsoft cloud as quickly as possible and use their robust network to move that media around.
So, Doya, sorry, maybe I can stop here. So in this scenario where you've got sort of two users, different countries, United States and Europe, in this case where you're using kind of the relay function then, is it fair to say that you talked about how Microsoft looks to try to understand where the two users are to connect them based on location, but in that case, it's probably more looking at kind of user location than kind of service assurance in terms of the actual network performance? Is that fair?
Yeah, so they're just looking at where they are and where they're coming in from, right? If I was using a VPN and I was accessing the internet through a VPN that was back at headquarters, then it would think that I was at headquarters.
Right. So user traveling, when we're all on the road and we use kind of a corporate VPN, it just assumes we're back in our home office. So because of that, the performance, may not be the same user experience, correct?
Right. It wouldn't be as good.
Correct. Okay.
So here's direct routing. Now, direct routing again is a way for enterprises to bring their own trunk, right? What we have here is we've got an SBC that is going to connect to the PSTN. And when I make a phone call that is outside of my organization, what will happen is you've got a number of other components of the phone system that become involved. You've got the PSTN hub and also a SIP proxy. That PSTN hub is what's going to figure out how to get it out of the organization, where that call needs to be directed to. And the SIP proxy is going to be able to communicate with the SBC using SIP. There's a big database that they have, a server that has a couple of big data kind of information in it. One are the routing policies for voice, as well as the SBC trunk configuration, so that they know where that SBC is and how to get to it, and get to it through the SIP proxy. And that PSTN hub will find out how to route the call. And then the other piece is just call detail records that help with monitoring and troubleshooting. So when a call comes in, remember this is HTTP REST, the signaling goes to the call controller just like it did before, but it's going to be going outside of the company. And so it finds out the voice route from the database and passes that along to the PSTN hub. PSTN hub understands that it needs to go out through the SBC, and the media controller decides what to do with the media portion. The PSTN hub will then send it through to the SIP proxy, which will then convert to SIP and talk to the SBC so that it can route the call outside of the company. The media will go through the media processor and then out to the SBC. So here I am making a call from inside my company to outside of my company without media bypass. And I'll explain what media bypass is on the coming slides because it's a little bit easier. But in this instance, the media still has to go up through the cloud. So again, you want to be accessing that cloud as close to your office as possible. Now, excuse me, the way that that media is transported is ideally through UDP, and so you'll need to make sure that they've got UDP ports open 3478 through 81, so that the audio portion of the call can go through. They prefer to use a UDP over a TCP because all of the packets aren't checked. They let the codec help with the call quality and to resolve any issues with packet loss or latency. And then at the end of the call, all of the details go into the CDR database so that they can look at that and find out what happened with the call if there was any issues.
So Dwight, in this scenario, can we maybe just go back for a second? In this scenario, without a media bypass, the role of the SBC is really basic connectivity. Is that correct in terms of managing interfaces with the SIP proxy? Is that?
Yeah, so what this is, and the whole reason that they came up with direct routing was so that they didn't have to provide the calling plan. So if you had a Microsoft calling plan in one of the countries where it was provided, then that PSTN hub would go out and use their own calling plan to connect to the PSTN, right? But in this instance, you've got your own SIP trunks that are coming in from your service provider. And this, again, is something I'm going to say that this one is on premises. That it needs to then go through the SIP proxy because it's using HTTP REST instead of SIP when it for the signaling when they
to register the session, everything like that. Okay.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Now with media bypass, what media bypass does, and you can see here, it's a little bit different. The media is going to go directly to the SBC. What we're saying here is that the Teams client is on the customer premises as well as the SBC, or the SBC has a public IP address that it can talk to directly. So as long as the phone system knows that customer that Teams client can talk to the SBC and send the media directly there, it won't hairpin it up through the relay in order to get it out to the PSTN. And that's a very big deal. So they're always making sure that that media is taking the optimal path. So again, in this instance, everything is pretty much the same, except that you've got media bypass turned on, and so it's not going to go through the media processor in the phone system. It's going to go straight to the SBC, and then the SBC will deliver that out to the PSTN.
And that sorry, Dwayne, and that should give the CSPs providing those enterprise services better insight into the actual performance and monitoring and troubleshooting, correct?
Yeah, because that's something now that you can look at. Either you're dropping these like EdgeMark devices that you can monitor remotely on the customer premises, or you've got something that's in your own network, and obviously you've got a lot more capabilities of monitoring something that's in your network than something that isn't.
Right, and in some respects, it kind of maybe adds value to SIP trunking because it kind of extends sort of the reach of SIP trunks. So SIP trunks go from simply being accessing to Office 365 to being sort of something that you can actually kind of monitor on sort of an end-to-end basis. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Okay, here's a little different scenario. So the client here is outside of the customer premises, and the SBC is not directly accessible from the internet, so it doesn't have an IP address that's public, which means that it can't do the media bypass like it did on the last one. So in that instance, when it can't get there, it will bring the media through the relay. And again, it's going to find the closest transport relay and then transfer the media over the Microsoft Global Network out to the SBC. Sorry, Jim, did you have, are there any other things that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think this one too. Maybe the only point I wanted to make here is that so in this one, the client's located outside the customer premises, so the SBC is kind of really providing that bypass functionality. But in this case, really the difference between that and the previous one is just kind of how the access is managed by the SBC, correct? In terms of the need for a SIP proxy. Is that correct?
Right. It's just a matter of whether or not the client can send the media directly to the SBC, right? Otherwise, it needs to go through the relay. So, and it's almost like if it was, here the SBC is, in between them and the receiver of the phone call. If the person was on premises, it would send that media peer-to-peer. If they had media bypass, they would send it from peer to SBC. But if they can't resolve that address, just like if there was a NAT in between, then they wouldn't be able to resolve that address internally. They'd have to go through that relay.
And this kind of goes back to my earlier statement. I sort of my view that by doing direct routing with media bypass, you can provide sort of the same sort of capabilities for a remote branch or a branch office as a kind of corporate. So in this case, what you're saying is this one is where the client maybe is outside the customer premises, so in some respects it might be kind of a remote user, so maybe traveling. So in this case, even though the relay is involved, because the SBC is predominantly managing kind of the call flow and applying policies, because of that, it's basically kind of the same service capability, correct?
Right. It finds out, how that SBC is configured, so the media relay, the transport relay knows how to send that media out to that SBC because it has the SBC trunk configuration in the database, right? And
once
the client can't resolve the address directly,
right? In
this case,
but in this case, the relay is kind of the main point of the relay is simply to understand the closest SBC that can provide the capabilities to manage the call and route it.
The relay knows what SBCs you have in your organization and knows which one to send it to. Okay. Again, the optimal path, right? They're always looking for the optimal path.
Right. And maybe just one quick question here. There's been a lot of work in the industry to create, software-based SBCs. is there some sort of additional role that a virtualized SBC plays here? You can apply more software-based SBCs in different locations. Is there some sort of value proposition virtualizing it, or is it pretty much the same?
So it really kind of depends on what you need to connect to, right? If you need PRI ports or FXS, FXO on the back of the SBC, then obviously you're not gonna get that with a virtual SBC that's just sitting on a virtual machine on some server someplace. Okay. But if all you're looking for is the capability, the security aspects, being able to prevent DDoS attacks and being able to route calls and transcode from one codec to another, then there's a lot of flexibility with virtual SBCs. And the other thing is we've got a virtual SBC that works in Microsoft Azure, right? In the Azure Marketplace, you can test that out. Actually, there's a 30-day free trial of Ribbon's SBC SWE-Lite that is in the Azure cloud, and that makes an even better experience as far as optimization with regard to the media path, right? Because it's in the same network already.
Okay, great. Okay, that's great. Okay, so let's we're a little bit tight of time, so let's move on to our next poll question before we get to the Q&A. So excellent presentation, Dwight. That provided a lot of value to me too. Make sure I understood all the different scenarios. But we're going to ask the audience before we get to the Q&A. We've got a couple questions from the audience. The first question is, why haven't you implemented the direct routing media bypass option? Is it you're not sure of the network requirements, including SBC, not sure how easy it is to implement, we don't need it, we don't want to change our current network configuration, or wasn't aware we could do that? So while we are waiting, I do want to ask a question here about SBCs. And obviously the SBC, as you've gone through in these call flows in detail, plays a key role for things like supporting direct routing as a service. But, you're saying, to make sure I want to understand this, and this is what the question is all about, if you support direct routing as a service, are the requirements to have certified core as well as edge SBCs, or is it a matter of, can you use an edge SBC, or could you use simply a core SBC that's supported multi-tenant capabilities? How does that work in terms of deploying an SBC that's certified? Where is it deployed? Is it core and edge, or can you do either one?
Either or both, actually. A lot of, we've got a couple of service providers that have largely scalable SBCs in their core network, and they like them there because they can control that. And what they do is they already have people accessing their network. They've been providing SIP trunks, and so the SBC resides on their core network, and they can house more than one customer on a given SBC. And so, depending on how many concurrent sessions each customer needs, it scales up to hundreds of customers potentially, and that will also sort of decrease the number of things that you need to look at. There's also the idea, however, of there's sort of a single point of failure there too, that if something goes wrong, it goes wrong for everybody, right? Now, I will say that that doesn't happen on the hardware side as much as it does on the configuration side. We've got one customer, New Wave Communications, that has had a couple of high availability SBC pairs in their network, and they haven't had any downtime for the last 8 years.
Okay, good.
But the other thing that you can do is you can put these devices out onto the edge, and that way you have more flexibility and you can treat different people differently, and you sort of can look at those things individually. Right.
Okay. Okay. So here's the answer from the poll from the question we asked about direct routing media bypass. The number, I guess, tied for 31%. Both were not sure how easy it is to implement, and I think we've hopefully in this webinar we talked about that it is a fairly straightforward implementation with a certified SBC. Or the other one was we don't need it, we don't want to change our current network configuration. I think as all of us are kind of long-time enterprise corporate users, that's probably not too much of a surprise that there's kind of a sometimes reluctances to change network configurations, kind of just to manage the number of users as opposed to changing configurations. 23% said they weren't aware of that, and 15% said they weren't sure of the requirements. So hopefully we've addressed the requirements in this webinar in terms of the SBCs, and also we've hopefully some of the audience understand now how they can use this capability, and it actually is easy to implement. So we're going to get to some more Q&A from the audience, but before we do that, I just wanted to push this URL out. As the operator said at the beginning of the call, we would appreciate it if you could take this survey and provide us feedback on today's session. That'll help us for providing future sessions as well. So there are a couple more questions here. Okay, so, and I think you talked a little bit about this, Dwight. It said, with the virtual SBC, can it be in the Azure network, and what is the impact? And the second question is, does the SIP proxy become part, or can the SIP proxy, or does it become part of the SIP proxy become part of the virtual SBC?
Well, the phone system is going to use its own servers in order to route the call. So, number one, we already talked about it, the fact that it is in the Azure network. However, when you go through the phone system is going to decide where to send the information to the SIP signaling to the SBC that happens to be in the cloud. It still needs to convert that from HTTP REST to SIP, and the SIP proxy is what's going to do that.
Okay, great. Okay, and there's a couple of questions I'd like to get to. One is related, we talked about service assurance. So when you talked about service assurance, you talked about monitoring and things like that. The question basically is, when you talk about service assurance, are you also kind of looking at how service providers can not only provide service assurance as a service, but also enhance their security as a service? Because that's obviously kind of a hot topic for a lot of service providers to sell these features to their enterprise customers. Is that a fair statement as well?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of lumped things into service assurance because we were talking about the call quality and that sort of thing. But there's lots of stuff, right, that SBCs do, and being able to provide that through the SBC. Some of these things come with additional licenses, other ones don't. And certainly we've seen a lot of our service providers that add line items to the invoice based on some of the additional features and functionality that come from the SBC.
Okay. And I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. This one is related to cloud PBX. And I guess really the question is, I mean, we've been talking about as an industry about cloud PBX for some time. Are you seeing a lot of intent to use kind of this migration path using Microsoft Teams and direct routing to sort of enhance sort of the simplicity or the transition to a cloud-based PBX? You had a slide that talked about it. Are you kind of seeing market momentum with that? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things when you think about having an SBC in the finalized architecture, but in between, as you're migrating, Microsoft is going to recommend to their customers that they don't move everyone to Teams overnight or even over the weekend, that they do it in groups, and they sort of do it gradually. Having an SBC that connects the old to the new as it's transitioned is very important. And then obviously there's always going to be some things that you're going to need that SBC for, whether it happens to be an emergency telephone in the elevator or in the parking lot or fax machines and that sort of thing. Okay, and the last question is, obviously Microsoft Teams Direct Routing provides sort of the same performance, and I kind of talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the call as kind of the traditional enterprise model. But we talked a little bit about scale as well, but is it fair to say that this approach, by allowing the service provider kind of have end-to-end control over the call, is not just service assurance and security we talked about, but it also will sort of be a better way to deliver sort of some of the new ultra-low latency services that are going to be coming into enterprises in the next couple of years? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Let the experts, the network experts and the telephony experts deal with it, I would think. What I've seen is that
I'm going to be going to Microsoft Ignite in a month, and I'll talk to people there, and a lot of them, if they're from an enterprise, they have basically been handed Teams calling because it starts with Teams, and they're sort of
Correct.
managing and administering the collaboration, right? And now suddenly they have telephony, and there's a bunch of terms that are new to them. It's much easier to outsource that as an enterprise and just hand that off to the service providers, and then the service providers also can couple that with other services, like you said.
Great. Okay, well, interesting times, and so first of all, Dwight, excellent presentation. I'd like to thank you and your company, Ribbon Communications, for sponsoring today's session and providing the content. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for attending today's session. We hope to see you at future sessions. So for Light Reading, this is Jim Hodges. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.